Okay, welcome everyone. I want to basically give you an overview. We've heard some passionate descriptions of Cash's Ledge. I think, John, was compelled by a lot of the stuff you were saying there, but I think the stories of fishing folks on Cash's Ledge and the wonderful trips that were spent out there. I do question, I think it's important, I enjoyed the fact that we have a scientist here, because a scientific basis for anything that we do is what's going to be important. And one of the concerns I have is what we believe has changed on Cash's Ledge since 1980. If anything, it's been a lot of protections actually that's happened. So it's a little bit concerning. As far as process goes, is a national monument executive order the correct thing to do at this point, especially after there's been a quite lengthy process for protection? Cash's Ledge has been protected since 2000, and it's quite large. It's much larger than the Cal Forest or the ledge itself. We've done that through the Omnibus Habitat Amendment. And the Omnibus Habitat Amendment, the reason why it's omnibus is all fisheries controlled by the National Fisheries Service that would interact with that space is going to have to abide by. In other words, it's all encompassing the protections, and mostly it's a mobile gear protection. The MN Rock area is actually protected from all use, and it's a pretty sizable area, about 6 square miles, and it goes deeper than the, I think you mentioned 40 meters for the kelp. So that process went on for about 10 years, 8 years in earnest, and it took about the first 5 years to develop a scientific model that could determine just what does need to be protected and what scientifically is there a way to come up with objective methods and models to do that. That took quite a while to get to the point, and they developed a method to do that. It was called the SASSI model. But then there's, so we're looking at the process of the Antiquities Act from a fisheries standpoint after during 8 years of that process that are advocating for the use of this right now. We're involved in that process, and the feeling from the fishing community is this is sort of an end run to it. Well, the process got what it got. It was actually quite a sizable closure, and we've been, fishing communities have conceded to that at this point. And so, this, and we haven't talked about delineations yet. For the exact, it's the first time actually, Peter, that any of us have seen a delineation, which is the existing Cash's Ledge closure. So it seemed like it's been in a vacuum. It hasn't been talked about. It hasn't been really a process for looking at the areas and justifying them, both whether it's scientifically or for any other justification that someone may have. And then the seamounts is sort of a preemptive. One feels like going around, well, we finished the process of 8 years of a lot of public input, a lot of public comments, a lot of testimony, a lot of direct involvement in the scientific bodies and the plan development teams, and then we settled on a democratic process that the ink hasn't dried on it yet, hasn't been approved. But it did go past the first, the council process, and it's at NOAA as we speak now. While it's at NOAA after an 8 or 10, potentially this going around and being a permanent protection. And the seamounts have already initiated an amendment process to get into the deep sea coral, the science of that, rather than just say this is just a big area that's wonderful and special. Trust us, President Obama close it permanently. We use a democratic process and a scientific process and go through the years of doing that. And from a process standpoint, less about the merits of the areas. That's probably the biggest concern that we have. As I said, the swept area seabed impacts model is the SASE model that was used by the government to, and there was a broad participation in the creating of that model. Peter Oster was, I know, involved in the SASE model. And the alternatives that were selected were based upon that model. The footprint of non-government research. John mentioned quite a bit of experience that he's had out there, but one of the things that the Northeast Seafood Coalition did during the amendment process was there were a lot of compelling stories and pictures and photographs and a lot of media that went out there and education that went out there, but we asked what was the footprint of that photography? What was the footprint of that research? Was it peer reviewed? How intense was it? And we really couldn't come to any conclusion as to how much that was. It seemed as though it was basically funding dependent. It was very sporadic. There was no time series to it. So when we asked about the intensity, the frequency, and the regularity of non-government science, it was pretty sparse, actually. And there are papers that have been written and a lot of hypotheses and conclusions drawn from not quite that much research. So that was a concern. And also the funding, that was the biggest problem. It's really difficult for the universities and scientists to be able to keep a steady funding stream. The climate change and the effects on the Gulf of Maine, done some research over the years and looking at this, and set aside the issue of climate change and the warming in the Gulf of Maine. That's measured, that's done with a thermometer. I mean, it is what it is, right? So set that aside. Let's accept the fact that the climate is changing. But from this perspective, from fishermen's perspective, the stocks are not moving. And when you look at all of these websites and folks that talk about these research, they use justification of evidence being what they're seeing in these very sparse research that they're doing. One of them is that stocks are moving east and into deeper water. The cod, the haddock, the pollock, the hake are leaving the area, and something new is coming in. In the Gulf of Maine and Georges Bank, there have not been regime shifts. That's what that is a regime change, where you used to find haddock and cod, you're now finding black sea bass and scud. It's not happening. So that would show in the landings, that would show the fishermen. So there are things used to justify the huge impacts that are happening in the Gulf of Maine from climate change, but we're not seeing it in those. Now maybe they're measuring in zooplankton and the different organisms that fishermen aren't seeing. But it's very difficult for the fishing community to buy into something when they read that the cod have left, the haddock have left, when in reality they're still here. We're finding them in the same places, in the same densities as we always have. And the variability in catch is a cyclical thing that, you get a couple of years that it's bad, and that happens to be the time that everybody says, see, the cod have left. But then as soon as you tell them, hey, they're back, nobody responds to you. No, they're not. It doesn't fit the model. So the gap between the model and fishery independently derived assessments, because that's really what we have. Fishermen's data is not used to determine the size of the stock, with the exception of how much fish is coming out. All the fishery-dependent data these days is only used to determine how much fish is removed. It doesn't inform how much fish is actually there and how much fish is in the ocean at any one point in time, or how productive that fish stock is. So that's a problem, and the gap now between the model and fishery independently derived assessments has never been wider between what fishermen see and what these independent models are seeing. So that's a real problem. And when we're talking about fishing community buy-in to something like this, it's really difficult to know that the only way you have to buy into this is in the context of your stocks are in disaster. And the disaster is fishermen are trying to avoid fish that the government's saying doesn't exist. Even recreational fishermen are now saying, what the heck happened? The fish are all over the place and we can't get there. Wait a minute, let's get a national monument out there and bring the biodiversity back. Sorry. So fisheries management and catches closure. we were under an effort control system, and I think that's something everybody should understand. The closure that we have on Cash's Ledge was done as a mortality closure under the old effort control system. Prior to 2010, we controlled fishing by handicapping fishing. I think Peter and a lot of folks on the side of look, we got to get more accountability, we got to have a more direct control of fishing than just handicapping fishing. You know, we agreed with that. But the big fear that we had of getting out of the old effort control system was that it had to rely on good science. You can't have an output control. You can't say this is the only amount of fish that you can catch exactly on every stock unless you can forecast it correctly. If you forecast it incorrectly, and we always did, humans have yet to get a handle on how to get the right estimate of how much fish is in the ocean at any one time in those 19 stocks that we harvest. And once you go to an output control system, what's happening to the fishery, what's collapsing the fishery is the fact that the science can't get those numbers right. And we have such an accountable system now through an output control that it reduces the quotas and you're instantly out of business without even going fishing. So that's the effort control system is what brought us the Cash's Ledge closure that you see today. Not habitat, not biodiversity, because that was the fishing grounds. That's where people caught the most fish. And so they took the areas, not just Cash's Ledge, we had a series of closures in the effort control system. And if you look at them, they took all of the vessel trip reports and logbooks to say, that's where I was catching my fish, and those were the areas that and a lot of fishermen offered that. It's like one way to handicap us is to not have caches open if we're trying to protect codfish. I mean, that's what was happening. Because the only thing that was controlling us was the days at sea that were allowed. So